So we spent the last 8 weeks or so talking about Proverbs, talking about practical applications of wisdom, how we can live our lives in such a way to get the practical benefits from it, so that when we are presented with the choice between wisdom and foolishness, we know which one to pick, and we can recognize it. So all of that takes us then to Ecclesiastes, which is a whole different thing. And in a way, it's a nice follow-up, because it's not so much telling you the practical as much as it's trying to answer the question of, how do I live in this world, and why do I live? What is the thing that should be driving me? What is the thing that should be moving me forward as I run into difficulties in this life, when I get frustrated that I don't find satisfaction in the various things that I try? What's that about? And so as we look at Ecclesiastes, we're gonna try to get some answers to that from the writer. Now, I'll tell you that while I didn't do an exhaustive search of material on Ecclesiastes, what I learned from the stuff that I did look at is that opinions on Ecclesiastes vary wildly from one end of the spectrum to the other. And since that's true, I've decided to just tell you what I think about it. Now, to be honest, a lot of what I think about it was informed by a lot of those articles that I looked at, because I saw a lot of sense in what they were saying. But when I talk about what I see overall, this is mostly kind of what I get from it. And you may get something different from it, and I think that's okay, and you may get a different viewpoint from it than what I present, and I think that's okay, because I think that the truths that are presented in Ecclesiastes come to you whether you think this book is pessimistic or whether you think it's affirming. I think you could still find the truths that God is trying to get us to understand from the content in here. Now, a couple of things. The thing that surprised me probably most in the research, I always just assumed the writer was Solomon. I mean, it says, I am the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. I just assumed, okay, well, that's Solomon. Well, apparently that's not even settled. People have different opinions about whether it's Solomon. I'll tell you this much. I think it's Solomon, but I don't think it matters. I don't think it makes any difference whether it's Solomon or some other writer in terms of the content being presented, for two reasons. The most obvious being, as in anything in Scripture, no matter who the actual writer is, the ultimate writer is God. But secondly, I think that the truths in here don't rely on Solomon's experience. The wisdom that is presented here, there's nothing that you look in there and you say, well, he's only saying that because he had this experience or he had that experience. I think it explains a few things pretty conveniently. But I was surprised at how many people disagree about that. And like I said, I don't think in the end it really makes that much of a difference. I do think that, and I said this back in week 1, if you remember, when we talked about the wisdom literature in general, when you read Ecclesiastes, a lot of it depends on what your mindset is when you go into it. If you're kind of having a not a great day, or one of those days where you feel like life is meaningless, it's sure going to help you with that. It's going to drive that whole "it's helpless" theme right through you. If you go at it from the standpoint of, things in this life are bad, but God is there, and that's great, and that's what's going to help me, you're going to get that out of here too. So in both cases, like I said, how you approach it, cynics love Ecclesiastes. People who don't like the Bible, they love Ecclesiastes, because they're like, look at this, it's all meaninglessness, we have nothing. But they conveniently ignore the places where he says, well, unless there's a God, And I think that's the central thing. When we look at Ecclesiastes, when you boil it all down, and he does this in chapter 12, and we will certainly get there, but when you boil it all down, life is pretty meaningless unless there's a God, unless there's a purpose to why we're here, and the things that we experience in here are not the ultimate thing. So that's the piece that as you kind of look through this, if you kind of keep that element with you, I think it brings a lot of these verses more clearly to light. One of the authors I read said that Ecclesiastes explains the purpose of life and the futility of living without God, and specifically without wisdom. And if you think about the book of Proverbs that we just finished studying, you remember how wisdom was crying out in the streets because people would not listen. They just would not listen, and wisdom was crying out, I have the knowledge for you. And Ecclesiastes is like, this is what wisdom was talking about in Proverbs. This is why you need that wisdom, because otherwise, this is what you're going to see. So does that kind of make sense from a starting point? All right. I do think that the other thing I want to point out up front, and y'all have read Ecclesiastes, and I hope that you're seeing the same things that I'm seeing and that we're going to be able to discuss these things. But to me, unlike some of the readings that I did in research, God is all over the place in Ecclesiastes. This is not a book that is absent of God. We are told, all of the attributes of God, in periodic sections as we get through the book. We're told that God provides food and drink and work. We're told that, God sees everyone, both the sinner and the righteous, and he's paying attention to what we do in this life. And, we'll get to that, but that's in chapter 2. That the things God does are different from what we do because the things God does are eternal. And they're hard to understand because their timescape is not our timescape, and we don't understand all the things that God does, but we do know that whatever he does is forever. And then the other thing is that God empowers his people to enjoy what he has provided. Enjoyment comes from God. It is a gift that is given to us. And that enjoyment is the thing that the writer continues to come back to as he's exploring all of these different journeys that he goes on. And he comes back to that, and it's provided by God for us. So I want to make sure you're kind of thinking about that as we go through some of the discussion here, because Ecclesiastes, at its essence, is about a journey, right? It's a journey from what is this all about to I know what this is all about, let me tell you, And really, from my point of view, it's about a lot of little journeys, because the writer is going to go on a bunch of different quests. And they're like, let's try to find some satisfaction this way. Oh, that didn't work. Let's try to find some over here. And he's going to kind of evaluate all of those different things and kind of talk about them. But it always comes back to what is God providing, and where is God's place in the whole discussion. So thoughts on that as we jump in? All right. So let's look at chapter 1. Now, I asked a couple of questions online, and this is kind of where we're going to go with this stuff. The very first thing we get right after we're told that this is the preacher, the son of David, is vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What is vanity? Not a word we use. I mean, vanities are little tables that women do their makeup at, right? I mean, that's not what this is. What is vanity? I beg your pardon? Useless. Okay. Other thoughts? Beg your pardon? One more time. Okay, absolutely. It's weird. My Bible doesn't do a lot of extended explanation of stuff, but for vanity, or go ahead, Carolyn. Futility. Okay. Yeah, and mine has a note that says it's absurdity, it's frustration, it's futility, it's, I love this one, nonsense. I like nonsense, right? It's all nonsense. That's what he's saying. Now that's quite a way to start off the book. But that's the idea. Whenever you see vanity, grab your favorite one of those words in the list and stick it in there, because that's what he's really saying. This is absurd. This is useless. This is foolishness. This is nothing. It's nonsense. And so he begins with that, and he really is asking a question. In verse 3, he basically says, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? That's the question of the book, right? What's this thing all about? What is the value of life? Why am I here? Right? Philosophy 101 question. If you've been in college and you go in there and you think, I'm going to get the wisdom of the ages in there. That's, all the great philosophers. What is my purpose? Why am I here? Well, that's the question that's being asked that the book is going to answer for us. It's going to tell us what is the purpose. And I think when you look at the first couple of chapters here, what you start to see is a pattern. There's a pattern to everything. And in fact, even in verses 4 through 10 of chapter 1, he gives us patterns. What do we see that we always see? In verse 4, okay, well, we got one generation, they pass away, and here comes another one, right? The sun comes up, the sun goes down, the sun comes up. The wind goes south, the wind goes north. The rivers empty into the sea and start over. It's all a pattern. It's all just a circular, repeating thing. And yet, knowing that, man is not satisfied. We are not satisfied to just go, well, that's what it is. Why is that, you think? Andy?
Because in that cycle, we're only part of a small section of the overall cycle, and we don't make a difference.
Okay. Andy says it's because we're a small part of the cycle and we don't make a difference. And there's a sense to which that's true, but at the same time, there's a sense in which we are part of the cycle, right? We're the generation that comes up and moves on, and the next generation moves in after us. Right, and that's part of the frustration, right, is that we're only here while we're here. And after that, who knows? And you're going to get that application to an awful lot of stuff in Ecclesiastes, right? It's like, I'm going to accumulate all this stuff, and who knows what's going to happen to it once I'm dead? Who knows if the person who gets all my stuff has any sense of it, or are they going to just waste it? Is it going to be completely undone? So all of that's there. I think the other piece of this, and he kind of talks about this in different pieces in here, is that we're not supposed to be satisfied with that. That's part of what God has put into us, that there is more than just this cycle. And it's like, oh, well, we're here, we're going to live, we're going to die. Here comes the wind, it was here yesterday. There's more. And that sense of more is provided by God. It says in Ecclesiastes, he has put eternity into our hearts, right? He's given us a sense that it's more than just the 80 years that we're here. There's 80 years and 80 years and 80 years after, and there was all this before, and there's a purpose to all of it. It's not just a cycle. It's not just something that goes on and around. So that's a piece of this that we kind of need to recognize up front. And I think he tries to set that stage in chapter 1. If you look at the things that he says, just don't seem to offer any value, any kind of recognition. Look at the things he calls out. In verse 11, he talks about there's no remembrance of the former things. there's not going to be a remembrance of the things that are going to come after. The people who come after, in short, everybody dies and they get forgotten, right? So just the fact that you're alive, that doesn't answer the question. In verse 15, he talks about, the things that we can't do. We can't make, crooked things straight. Now, in limited senses, yes, we can, but in the bigger picture, we can't make crooked things straight. When when we start making a list of the things that are lacking, we run out of numbers. I mean, it just keeps going. And so I think the point there is life itself. You can't answer all the questions that you're going to run into in this life. And then he says, and I love this in 16 and 18 of chapter 1, he says, I communed with my heart saying, look, I have attained greatness. I have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceived this was also grasping of the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief. And he who increases in knowledge increases sorrow. You ever see that commercial that shows up, I think, on NBC every once in a while, the more you know? Those little snippets that we're trying to give you some valuable tidbit, and the more you know. What I get from this is the more you know, the more frustrated you become because you cannot get to the answer to the question that is just beyond your knowledge. Solomon knows all of this stuff, and he just doesn't have it. Assuming it's Solomon. Even if it's not, he still doesn't have it. And so it's not about wisdom. And these are all big picture questions, right? These are the things that people sit around and go, what is the purpose? What is the value? But it's also in little things, right? There's, in chapter 2, he says, what about just giving yourself over to laughter? What about giving yourself over to just having a good time and accumulating a bunch of possessions? He who dies with the most stuff wins, right? Is that going to get it done? You guys know the answer. No. Why doesn't that get it done? Why doesn't going after just collecting stuff, why doesn't that satisfy us? I'll go ahead and then I'll get to Lee.
2 reasons. There's always someone with more stuff. And when you're gone, you don't take it with you.
Yeah, you can't take it with you, and somebody's always got more, right? Lee?
This is a crazy, to me anyway, book to read and comprehend. Wisdom is not useless. Pleasures are not meaningless, but they are. But we have to get to the end of the book before we understand things. And we got to go through life and experience things before we can understand them sometimes.
Lee says, wisdom is not useless, pleasure is not valueless, but it is, right? And that's a great way to talk about Ecclesiastes, right? Because I think that throughout the book, when he goes back and gives us these little glimpses of God, what he's got is this big thing under a curtain, right? Under this big tarp. And he's kind of going, all right, look, there you go, right? 3 chapters later, ooh, look over here. Okay, there you go. It's not until the end that he's going to pull the whole tarp off. But he's going to give you little glimpses to try to get you to understand what Lee is saying, which is he's never saying that these things aren't necessarily enjoyable. He's never saying that these things aren't necessarily entertaining or temporarily satisfying. But what he's saying is it's not enough. Matt.
And make rotten idols.
Yeah, Matt says they make terrible idols, and exactly right, Yes, sir.
What comes to my mind is pleasures can be meaningless because the more we have, the more we want, and with all the stuff we already have, it might keep us away from the most important goal, which is to spread the word to others, because we're too busy with our stuff that we can forget what's most important.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, right? It just feeds it, right? It's kind of like, a little kid in a candy jar, right? That first piece of candy, and then I need another one, I need another one, I need another one. Yes, Laura.
Person, it goes both ways, is that we get used to anything. And we're going to see that over and over. But whether it's pleasures or whether it's troubles and working hard, I think back on the way that we lived when we were first married and the things that we ate when we were first married. And now it's not like all of a sudden we went, oh, now we have all the money in the world, so we're going to eat real good. It's incremental change. But I've gotten so used to it over time that to think about going back to 15 years ago is like, I'll just starve to death, thanks, I'm good. Because I've gotten used to the increases in pleasure. They don't bring me as much pleasure as they did when we first started changing things.
Yes. And that's, both of you kind of make that same point, right? You get used to it and it doesn't satisfy like it used to.
Whenever they want.
Yeah, all the groundhog you want, because you have the ones that are near me too. But yeah, it is true, and that's where Ecclesiastes starts breaking into levels, right? Because not only is he talking about the different things that you can try to experience to find satisfaction, but at a higher level, what he's saying is God is aware that these are the things that we try to fill our days with. And God is trying to give us that picture up front that it's not good enough. It's not going to satisfy you. There is something more. And so, much like Proverbs, where wisdom is saying, I have it, just come take it from me. Ecclesiastes is saying, God knows that these are the things that you might want to chase after in the idea of satisfaction. And they're not good enough. And whether it's back in the day of the writer in Ecclesiastes, talking about accumulating wealth however you did it there, or whether it's working for that bonus at work, right, today. You can build your empire. You can have 75 people under you. You can have 150 people under you. You can have 1,000 people under you. And every one of them can be, feeding your salary, and you can get bigger bonuses and bigger bonuses. And it's really no different than it was in the days of the writer. There are opportunities for us to do the same things that are being talked about in here, but they're really not different. And that is, kind of at the end of chapter 1, where he says there's nothing new under the sun. Here you go. What is there that is new? Is there anything that is new? Well, yes, sort of, right? They didn't have plastic back then, right? They didn't have cars. They didn't have the internet. Well, yes, at a micro level, there are things that are different from what they had then. Does it change anything about what we're doing and the thing, and in a broad sense, what we're trying to do? Acquire possessions, acquire pleasure. None of that is different. The tools might be different. How?
One getting bigger and bigger and bigger, they would probably be running the world, and it'd be hard to convince people to look toward God, because these other guys have everything and they've done everything. this God's cycle, lets it happen for a while, then he brings it back down to a baseline.
Yeah, and I think that's true, is that, you see God's plan through all of this. You see it through history. You see it through, pharaohs and Caesars and all these leaders. It's always the same kind of thing that is going on. But you know what? Even in the little things like pleasure and possessions, or, he talks about, well, what about work? Well, what about just labor? I'm just going to really enjoy what I do. I've told my kids since they were small, I don't care what you do for a living, as long as it's legal and it pays your bills, because you ain't living here, right? But, but we want to enjoy our jobs. We want our children to enjoy their jobs, to take pleasure in the work that they do. But work isn't the be-all, end-all. No matter what you do or how well you do it, kind of to some points we've already made here, the next guy may mess it up, right? Or may just tear it all down. And so labor doesn't last either. There's no enduring satisfaction. We talk all the time about nobody put on their tombstone, I wish I'd spent that extra hour at work, right? And because at the end you figure out that wasn't the best investment of your time. But we're supposed to recognize that now, before it's the end, and kind of make that move on forward. So I think you see that, and then I want to drill into, so he's just depressed you for 2 chapters, right? This isn't any good. This isn't any good. This is not going to satisfy you. And then you get to chapter 2 and verse 24. And he says, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God, for who can eat and who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight, but to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give it to him who is good before God. This is all vanity and grasping for the wind. But the curtain's up a little bit, right? What's good? What is good for us to do? Matt. Exactly. Eat, drink, work. Enjoy it. That's what's good. There's nothing better. That's the first time he's going to insert God into the discussion, right? Like, God knows all this stuff is valuable. Don't let it run your life. Enjoy it, right? And every time we go through one of these patterns that just depresses you, there'll be a positive stuck right at the end of it, like its own little section of something, right? In chapter 3, we get that famous thing that's turned into a song and all this other stuff, right? To everything there is a season, right? Why is that in there? What's the point about there's a time for all of these different things? How does that fit this narrative that, is vanity? How is time vanity? I think there's a couple things. One is we don't have unlimited time. We've already made that point, right? We're here and then we're not. So there may be a time for all of those things, but it may not be in the time that I'm here, right? That's one of them. And then the other thing of this, and I thought this was an interesting comment I read from I can't remember which one of the commentaries I read about it, but I thought this was interesting. When you read through that, you realize that there is a right time and a right place for everything. And the wise man knows that. But the frustrating thing, the vanity of the thing, the nonsense of the thing is you can never know when it's the right time and the right place for all of these things. You just don't know. Is it a time to scatter? Is it a time to gather things up? I don't know. You know, maybe you got that one, but is it a time to, is it a time to refrain from embracing, or is it time to embrace? Well, apparently during COVID, it is time to refrain from embracing, but when is it a right time to embrace now? Ben.
Chapter 2, part of what he's doing is he's setting up how our lives function and how they work and how we have a time for this, a time for that, a time for that. But God doesn't work within those confines, that God is eternal, and we'll never actually completely understand all of what God has done before our existence, all of what he has done after our existence here on this earth, and just that God is so much contrasted with what we understand as humans.
Yeah, that is such a good point, and so true, that God is so beyond our time. And it says he makes all things beautiful in its time. We can't grasp any of that stuff because, the mountains are beautiful, but the mountains weren't always here, right? God made the mountains. The ocean is beautiful, but the ocean wasn't always here, right? God set up the ocean and the shoreline and all this other stuff. Yes, Laura?
Smaller context, time is slippery. I remember when my babies were teeny, an hour seemed like the longest time when one of them was screaming. And even now, just a few years removed, I look back at people who have little bitties and I say, oh, they're so precious. Because to me, that little bit of time screaming is nothing compared to the whole life of even my kids. Because time is such a difficult thing for us to grab onto. And so we don't have the God perspective to make sense of time, even in our own little lives, much less in a bigger context.
Yeah, and that's true. We don't have the God perspective, but we do get, and to latch onto that, we get the grown-up perspective a little bit, right? So, people would tell, people will tell you, you're going to blink and your kids are going to be grown, and you're like, yeah, whatever, right? But they've been there and they've seen that, and you turn back and yeah, that's true. Or, when you're just absolutely, their life is ruined, they're going, they got a B on their report card. They can't go to Harvard. It's over. Somebody's like, settle down. It's just a grade, And those are the things, we talk about all of these things that there is a time for under the sun. There is a time for all of these things. Beyond that time frame is God and the things that he has in mind and the things that he has set in place. Matt.
So this is a section just sort of about the oscillation of human existence. That there are people who think that mankind is progressing onto something. Solomon would disagree, if indeed this is Solomon. That instead it's just switching back and forth. The pendulum swings to one extreme and then back to the other, and then to the other, and then to the other, and so on.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think we think we're so advanced, and then we figure out, oh, wait a minute. We just discovered something that totally undid everything that we used to think we knew, right? My favorite class in school was philosophy of science, because the guy spent the whole time talking about how everybody thought Copernicus and Galileo were nutcases. Now they're these revered scientists who figured out that the sun doesn't actually go around the earth. Well, but at the time, that was science. That's what we knew, right? And so, and just that is just a snippet, right, of all of the things that we think we know. We think we know this, but, a line from a movie comes to mind, imagine what we'll know tomorrow, right? It's all relative within that time frame. And even there, when he says, God makes all things beautiful in his time, that's, again, lifting the curtain a little bit. There's something about God that we're never going to understand, and yet trust him. just like that person who says, relax, it's just a bee, right? And we come to trust that person because we realize over time, you know what, it's just a bee. Well, God, wants us to trust him because he sees what we don't see. He creates what we can't even fathom. He has a plan that is outside of our ability to grasp it. Lee.
Me, it's like God has us looking through windows as far as time goes. He says that's enough to look through a clear window, and then you have to look through a bigger window. And he wants us to keep looking forward. As someone said, that's why they make your windshield 20 times bigger than the rearview mirror, because you're supposed to look for what's ahead, not behind.
Yeah, that's a good analogy, and that's true, because God gives us windows to look through to find bigger windows, to find bigger windows, and I think that's kind of the idea here. I want to just mention the fact that in here he talks about injustice in chapter 3, but I want to come back to that. He talks about the fact that, really when you get right down to it, when you look around you, you're going to see injustice. It's everywhere. And you can't fix it all. It's going to be there one way or the other. And I think that's one of the things he's kind of laying out there for the next section of things that don't satisfy us, right? Because if you look where we're going now, he says he covers a lot of things that people take satisfaction in today, right? We've already talked about riches, right? The accumulation of wealth, not going to get it done, right? In chapter 6, he talks about large families, right? I've seen babies born to my servants in my house. I have this huge household. I have all of this family. Yeah, not going to satisfy. Or having a long life, again, in chapter 6. I've lived all of this time. I really want to make it to be 100 years old. Okay. But even then, you don't know what's coming next, right? You don't know who's coming after you. So none of those things are going to be satisfying. And when you look at that, then go back to chapter 5 and verse 18. And he says, here's what I've seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor, which he toils under the sun, all of the days of his life in which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth and given him power to eat it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, it is the gift of God. What does God say we should be doing? Enjoying what we have, right? Once again, it's not the getting of more stuff, it's the things that you have and enjoying it that is supposed to be the thing that is satisfying you. And not necessarily totally satisfying you, but enjoy that. And again, this concept that God is giving us to enjoy those things is the gift that he provides to us. You can enjoy it. You may choose not to. You may choose to be miserable and just work your life away. You can choose that. But God provides the opportunity for you to enjoy the things that you're given. Okay. So these texts talk about enjoying the blessings that God gives you. But like I said in chapter 3, when you look around you, even though you have those blessings to enjoy, you can also see injustice, right? You can see people who, just get mistreated. You also see that everybody dies, just like an animal, right? We're just like the animals in the sense that we're all going to die. But notice what he says in 16 and 17 of chapter 3. He said, moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of judgment, wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness, iniquity was there. And I said in my heart, God shall judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every purpose and every work. And this is where he starts to answer the question of when there's nothing you can do about it, where do you go to find satisfaction? And the answer is knowing that there is a God who is beyond time, and he sees it, and he's going to judge it. You know, we talk about that, you know, when there's great injustice, you know, and it seems like somebody got away with it, right? And, you know, it's almost the stuff, well, God knows. Well, you know what? God does know. And he knows whether that guy really got away with it or not, because in the end, there's no getting away with it with God. You know, in the end, there will be a judgment of the righteous and the wicked. And so by God being out there, you can take comfort. You know, Matt and I were talking right before we came in here, and Matt said, you know, I know it really wasn't the context of what we were talking about, Matt, but he said, I really don't know how people who don't go to church get along, right? I don't know how they, you know, how they make it. And this is one of the reasons, right? Because, you know, one person or 1,000 people or 1,000,000 people can affect change. But even after great change has been affected, you can look around and still see stuff that ain't right. And you just can't get to it. And man, that's frustrating. It shouldn't be that way. You know, well, it's going to be really pointless to life if there is no ultimate judge to that. But if there is a God, he'll take care of it. And so, again, he's pointing you to that broader picture that is outside of time, that is in God's hands and not in our hands. And he's basically saying, it's good that you see it, it's good that you try to make changes to it, but if you can't change it all, relax, because I got this. That kind of makes sense? Okay, so the other thing that you get from this, and I think, you know, in chapter 5 particularly, right, he brings this whole conversation around to God, right? It is all about our relationship with God, and specifically he talks about this in terms of making vows to God. And he basically says, be careful what you say. Be careful what promises you make. Because when you make a promise to God, he's paying attention. And you better answer that promise. You know, you don't want to be the guy going, well, I misspoke. Because that's not, you know. And so it's interesting how after 4 chapters really of just talking about the frustrations that we have in life, that he begins to talk about our relationship with God and our interaction with God that is different from how we interact with everything else. So next week, we're going to take that thought and kind of get through Ecclesiastes, theoretically. But thank you all for your time, and we'll see how it goes.
Teach me, Lord, to wait right down on my knees till in your